What a shame.
To truly understand the Deus Ex series, specifically the first two games, you have to understand Deus Ex's director, Warren Spector. Making his designer debut in 1990 on Ultima 6, Spector's innovative design philosophies have pushed the boundaries on the medium and have given us some of the best games ever made. Deus Ex's story really started in the 70s, in a Dungeons & Dragons campaign set in a cyberpunk universe.
And it began with a game of D&D. The day I discovered that game was literally life-changing for me. I would not be here, you would not be here, if not for a game of Dungeons & Dragons. My dungeon master was cyberpunk guru Bruce Sterling. But what made the experience special wasn't the story that Bruce was telling. What made the experience special was that my friends and I were telling the story with him. We had to use our wits and some more or less vague rules to get around and over and through the obstacles that Bruce threw at us. The shape of the story belonged to Bruce, but every detail belongs to us. I played in that D&D campaign for 10 years, and the ending of that campaign was so dramatic that if I told you about it, you would absolutely make fun of me because I would start crying. It was so powerful.
He wanted to make a game that replicated his experience with that D&D campaign. When John Romero finally offered him the opportunity to work on the game of his dreams, he simply couldn't say no. He left Origin and founded Ion Storm Austin, where he and a team of little more than 30 people went on to make Deus Ex, a true masterpiece of the role-playing genre. Spector's philosophy in designing Deus Ex was based on him wanting to make a game that used real-world logic instead of predestined puzzles with unrealistic solutions. One that didn't abide by industry standards but claimed new ground in how players would choose to interact with the virtual world. He had a burning desire to fulfill this goal, and he eventually did.
My entire career, 34 years of making games, has been about trying to recreate that feeling I had in 1978 when I played D&D for the first time. It was a period of time when I was sick to death of making games about guys in plate armor swinging big swords. If I even thought about making another game about you being the last space marine between the Earth and alien invasion, I was going to stop making games. I wanted to make a game that I called the real-world role-playing game. I wanted to make a game where you could solve problems the way you wanted. And I wanted your choices during play to make a difference in how the story played out. I wanted the choices to say more about you than they did about your in-game avatar. I wanted to tell a story with players just the way Bruce had told a story with me and with my friends.
Deus Ex was received incredibly well by critics and gamers alike, receiving over 30 Game of the Year awards. How do you follow up a masterpiece? No, really, how do you do it? Do you move on to something else, or do you try to replicate the success of the original in a sequel or spin-off? Or do you stop while you're ahead and simply go silent, hoping that you're remembered only for your best work? There's no easy answer, because no matter what you do, someone is going to be disappointed. That isn't to say that a sequel to a masterpiece can't be better than the original. Half-Life, for example, furthered the first-person shooting genre to heights it had never reached before. I'm sure it was a daunting task to follow up such an innovative title, and yet Valve somehow managed to do it. Half-Life 2 is better in virtually every way, and is still celebrated. Then again, we all know what happened to Half-Life 3. Many of the original team behind Deus Ex wanted to make a follow-up, improving the gameplay and telling a new and interesting story, and so Deus Ex Invisible War was put into development. Harvey Smith, lead designer for the original game, was put into the directorial position with Warren Spector's blessing, as he stepped back to merely supervise the production. Harvey Smith is a very talented designer, to be sure, having worked more recently on the likes of Dishonored, but handing the game off to someone who may have had less vision or passion for its future may have been its first mistake. Its second mistake was giving the role of lead designer to a relatively inexperienced member of the team. The game was given a larger budget than the first, but would obviously have to make up for it in sales. Making the game more accessible to a wide audience was one of the primary goals, being developed primarily for the original Xbox alongside the PC.
If, on the other hand, you're taking $20 million of somebody's money and you are, on the surface, aiming at an Xbox Live crowd, then going to some crazy extreme is probably not a good idea, right?
After a 3-year-long development cycle, the game was released. It garnered overall positive scores from major review outlets on both platforms it was released on, and was financially successful as well. It seemed that the mainstream market was quite fond of Invisible War. With such positivity encompassing the game, you'd think it would be remembered as one of the greats, but a quick Google search leads you to find that this is all but true. In actuality, it seems as though the internet has made a silent pact to forget it ever existed. Really, trying to find opinions on this game is like looking through a ghost town. It's all but dead on Steam, having only 57 people played it once in the 13 years it's been around. Even the developers of the game are strangely silent about it, they themselves recognizing that it just wasn't a good Deus Ex game.
I think in the end we made, an 85% rated RPG that was not a worthy sequel to the original game in terms of how interesting the original game was.
It's clear from every angle that the designers weren't coy to sacrifice depth and scale to accommodate the Xbox's hardware. The areas it's able to load are tiny and claustrophobic, hardly representing the massive cities like Seattle and Cairo it's supposed to. But wait a minute, the original Deus Ex had a decent PS2 port that more or less kept its depth. So what happened? Why was the game scaled back so much? The simple answer: graphics. As good as the original was, its graphics were never anything to drool over. In fact, they were a point of criticism from many reviewers. Its boxy level design, polygonal models, and simplistic physics wouldn't be enough to impress the Xbox crowd, who were used to products such as Halo or Homeworld 2. If Invisible War wanted to compete on the console market, it needed a serious visual upgrade. And upgrade it they did. For a game made in 2003, the graphics aren't half bad. The lighting is dynamic and the physics, while totally over the top, are still pretty entertaining. That apparently wasn't enough though. The developers paid more attention to focus groups than their actual fans, even going as far as to put the main character in a purple jumpsuit just because one person said people like purple jumpsuits. I'm sure that this also contributed to the game's setting, which was less set in the real world and more science fiction. The first game was completely grounded in real events and predictions for the future. Invisible War, on the other hand, was set only 20 years after the original, right after the biggest economic depression in history, and yet may as well be Star Trek. All realism and familiarity was disregarded in favor of generic sci-fi locales. A huge portion of this game feels like it was designed by a committee rather than some of the most talented people in the business. The aforementioned small areas are a bigger problem than you might think, considering the core of the first Deus Ex was being able to solve problems however you wanted from multiple angles. The fact that most of the levels are nothing more than a collection of hallways gives you very few options to navigate them. In the first game, it felt like you could do whatever you want. The developers put enough tools in the game to allow your own creativity to flourish. In this game, it feels like there just isn't enough room nor enough tools to do anything truly unique. All of your options are what the developers accounted for. There's also the problem that there are just straight up less options for how to handle situations. In the first game, there was never a keypad without a code to find for it. If you explored your surroundings thoroughly, you could always find a password or key code to open up optional routes or find useful items. If you knew the codes from a previous playthrough or say the internet, you could just pull them up without actually finding the data cube or conversation which tells you them. In the second game, they changed this completely. Only certain keypads have codes attached to them. The rest are only accessible through using multi-tools. You also don't actually input the code yourself. The game just opens the door automatically, which is actually a pretty smart way to prevent sequence breaking or cheating the system, but I'm not so sure I like it. I assume they made the choice to make only certain things have codes because of the fact that the lockpicking and multi-tool system were merged into one thing, just multi-tools. So, doors that would have previously been locked have been replaced with a keypad that has no code. This irks me in several ways. For one, I hate it when developers put locks in games without a key to find for them. This is especially annoying in a Deus Ex game where every problem is supposed to have more than one solution. It's also yet another reason why the small environment sucks so much. There probably just wasn't enough room to adequately hide enough data cubes to find the codes to open all these things, so there really wasn't a choice. The final thing that angers me about this system is how unrealistic it is. In the first game, your multi-tool actually looked practical, like you were hacking into the friggin' mainframe or something, and you had the lockpick, so things that would logically be protected by traditional locks were realistically accessible. In this game, all you do is pull out your friggin' magic wand and cast a little spell to open whatever you want, even a regular wooden door. This isn't feasible by any means whatsoever and completely brings me out of the experience. Furthermore, they completely messed up how weapons work in this game. For one thing, every weapon in the game uses the same ammo type. From a pistol to a sniper rifle, there's a shared ammo pool. Even the flamethrower and rocket launcher use the same generic clips. This is balanced by the fact that different guns use a different amount of ammo. Overusing the shotgun will deplete your ammo quite quickly, while a pistol or SMG will use a relatively small amount. They even got rid of the need to reload. You can fire as long as you want. This isn't streamlining, this is dumbing it down to the point of ridiculousness. There's no way you can take the settings seriously when a pistol and a flamethrower somehow use the same ammunition, and this just doesn't make sense from a gameplay perspective either. It's like they thought console users were too incapable to look around for different ammo types or press the reload button. Reloading in the first game was actually kind of important, and again, realistic. You were in serious trouble if you needed to reload in the middle of a fight because it took a considerable amount of time. Secondly, your skill with the weapons never increase. You're just as good with a gun at the beginning of the game as you are at the end, and this is a real shame because there was so much depth added to the combat when your hard-earned skill points were used to make you better at certain things. It reinforced the idea that the player was in charge of their own experience, that they could choose to specialize in a certain playstyle they enjoyed. Now every player is equal, and that's bad in the grand scheme of things. The augments are the only things that remain that make this game kind of an RPG. You now only have 5 slots for biomods, each slot giving you 3 choices for different augments. Some are much better than others. For instance, if you want to be at all sneaky, then the silent walking biomod is absolutely necessary. Trying to sneak without it will mean that guards from 2 rooms away will hear you even if you are crouched down, which is downright absurd.
I could have sworn. Better be a false alarm. Now I'm gonna kick your ass!
The neural interface is also pretty necessary, considering it's the only way you're allowed to hack into security stations, ATMs, and even a computer near the end that is required to complete the game. Conversations in this game are pretty underwhelming. You hardly ever get options in dialogue, and the NPCs look super stiff, like the animators didn't even bother to take the character models out of their default standing positions. Ever. NPCs will just stand there completely motionless, staring at you with their dumb faces. And the one with the dumbest face of all of them is your character, Alex Denton. On the topic of the player character, this time around you have a choice between a male or female. Personally, I find the female's voice actress much more appealing, and considering that you hear Alex's voice more than any other, the female character is the far better choice. Voice acting in general has improved from the first games, but that's hardly surprising. The actors in the first game were basically the bottom of the barrel in terms of quality.
I don't know what you mean.
The UI in this game is horribly designed. Squares are a game's best friend, in my opinion. The HUD is formatted into this weird circle thing, which takes up half of your screen. Every time someone calls you on your info link, it takes up half the little space you do get, which is all the time because NPCs are talking to you constantly. You get used to it after a few hours, but it just isn't very elegant nor intuitive. Not to mention that the inventory system was simplified to accommodate those pesky Xbox controllers as well. On top of all of this, the game certainly isn't technically sound. It crashed about once per hour, sometimes more. It's also pretty buggy. NPCs will stand in doorways a lot and refuse to talk to you if something goes wrong. Movement is buggy as well, to the point where you can consistently manipulate it, though it's mostly just annoying. You know, I really tried to like this game. Seriously, I did. There's something about it that just kinda clicks with me, you know? Maybe the futuristic setting and UI design remind me of Knights of the Old Republic. Maybe the blank cardboard stares of the NPCs remind me of Oblivion. Maybe the ridiculous physics remind me of Half-Life 2. All of these games were part of my childhood, and this piece of garbage has just enough of each of them to make me unable to truly hate it, even if it is an objectively bad game. It's not unplayable, that's for sure. It may be shallow, boring, and unintuitive, but it's by no means the worst game ever made. This time around, there's a much greater focus on your character and what you personally believe. The game revolves around a handful of factions vying for world power, and no matter which you choose, you're just their pawn, doing a list of chores that eventually changes the fate of the world. Overall, the story isn't bad, but it's far less focused on real plot in turn for petty squabbles between the factions. Which one you choose doesn't make a whole lot lot of difference either. They each give you the same missions, but tell you to do different things within the missions. For example, one faction may want you to kill someone, while another simply wants you to interrogate them. If you disobey one faction, the others will get angry at you, eventually to the point of attacking you on sight. In the end, your choices hardly matter because you can change which faction you side up with until the very last mission. It's all just an illusion to attempt to give the plot depth, but even that is paper thin. Eventually, about halfway through the game, I'd say, the story actually picks up and becomes a bit more complex, but even then it just gives way to retread the first game. Tracer Tong, Nicolette Duclair, and even JC Denton are major characters that play vital roles within the story, but it never feels quite justified as to why they needed to be there except to be a throwback to the original. All in all, it felt a bit uninspired. The main villain, I guess you could say, would have to be the Templars, an organization that wants to purge humanity of augmentation entirely. The role of antagonists naturally falls to them because you're radically augmented and they radically want to murder everyone. You can join them though, in fact, you kind of have to for at least a little while unless you want a practically impossible fight on your hands near the end. The final level of Deus Ex Invisible War is almost poetic. The first level of Deus Ex is the last level of the second game, Liberty Island. This could have been an amazing tribute to the original, but it ends up falling flat and being more of a microcosm of the failings of Invisible War. In the first game, the entire island was loaded at once, and the view distance was pretty impressive at the time. In the second game, they had to arbitrarily find a way to separate the island into two loaded areas and lower the view distance while keeping their pretty graphics intact. So they made the entire island frozen in snow and also really foggy. There isn't a good explanation as to why this is, and it was pretty disappointing. You do get to go back to UNATCO headquarters though, which I really enjoyed. I chose to side with JC Denton, mostly because he was the only one whose motivations I clearly understood. The others were too evil or too vague to really sympathize with. And then that's it. After only 9 hours of gameplay, it was all over. There was a quick cinematic and boom, back to the main menu. The first game took me over 20 hours to beat, so there's no contest as to which has more content. Gotta save that CD room for all that dynamic lighting, right? One nice thing I can say about it is that it doesn't overstay its welcome. You know, I've heard a few people talking online about how this game shouldn't be judged in comparison to the original, but on its own merits. That it isn't that bad if you simply ignore the fact that there's a Deus Ex stamp slapped onto the title. My question to this statement is, why? Why should it be judged by its own merits as if it isn't a part of the Deus Ex series? Because it is. Deus Ex Invisible War is in fact a Deus Ex game. Sequels deserve, and in a lot of cases, have to be judged while acknowledging their predecessors. Not to mention, this game is almost a direct sequel to Deus Ex. Several characters from the original show up and play vital roles in the story, so it isn't like it's very separable in the first place. If we simply ignore the fact that this game is a straight downgrade from the original, where does that take us? It takes us down. Down, further into mediocrity and lackluster products, with little to no artistic or intrinsic value. If we follow this line of flawed logic, we might as well ignore all poorly executed aspects of video games. If we simply pretend the flaws don't exist, then every piece of art is a masterpiece, right? No. This game should not be judged on its own merits. It should be judged bearing in mind that this is the direct sequel to one of the best games ever produced, and something that falls so short in virtually every aspect should not be acceptable. And that isn't to say you can't enjoy it. I myself love many things that are objectively flawed, but if we don't recognize and point out the flaws in the media we consume, then the standards just sink even lower. If you like this game, great. But it is objectively bad. So, in conclusion, Deus Ex Invisible War is a clear as day example of the dangers of consoleization, putting graphics over gameplay and giving focus groups too much control over the final product of your game. It was a mistake, one that very well may have spelled the eventual end of Ion Storm as the company closed its doors just a couple years later. The minds behind the first and second Deus Ex have all moved on to bigger and better things, thankfully. Invisible War's greatest sin is that it had no purpose in its existence in the first place. It has nothing to say, nothing for the player to contemplate, no issue to ponder on. In the end, it will be forgotten, lost in the shadow of the greatness of the other games in the series, and that's probably for the best. If you have an interest in the Deus Ex series, where it came from, where it went, I wholeheartedly recommend you play this game for the sake of understanding it. My name is JaBoc, and may we meet again!
This is really important to me. It may or may not be important to you, but do you have something to say? There has to be something more, in my opinion, in a game than what's happening just on the surface level of action, okay? If you don't have something to say, a theme or an issue you want players to explore, you are kind of wasting players' time, and you are wasting your time. In Deus Ex, I wanted to explore all sorts of big issues, and I wanted players to explore those things in ways that only games could allow them to do. Any game that has any kind of narrative, however deep, can actually ask players to think about something.